On a Tuesday that had no plans to get itself noticed, Fritz discovered treason in the salt cellar. You wouldn't think salt could betray anybody. It's got one job, and it doesn't apologize for doing it well. But when Fritz Brenner came into the office with his big Swiss hands clasping a small blue ramekin like a broken heart, I knew we were going to hear about integrity. "It has been changed," he announced, his voice carrying the weight of a man who had discovered heresy in his own kitchen. "What's been changed?" I asked, because the morning was peaceful, and I had no objection to spoiling it gradually. "The salt," he said, afflicted. He held the ramekin toward me, palms up. "That is not the fleur de sel I put out last night." I took a look. To the untrained eye, which mine will admit to being before coffee, salt is salt, but these crystals were chunkier than they should have been, like chopped glass instead of snowflakes. I did the unwise thing and put a few grains on my tongue. It was aggressive and coarse, like a barfly with opinions. If Fritz was right, our table had been demoted. Nero Wolfe did not lift his eyes from the morning paper. That could be because he was absorbed in a column about municipal contracts, or because acknowledging Fritz's distress might imply a commitment to doing something about it. Wolfe prefers his commitments measured by the hour and paid for. "Should I call the State Department or start with your pantry?" I offered Fritz sympathetically. Fritz gave me a look that would have curdled hollandaise. "I do not misplace salt, Archie." "Of course not. It's salt. It misplaces you." "Pfui," Wolfe said from behind the paper. And since he is the only man I've ever known who can pronounce that without sounding like he's trying too hard, I let it sit. Fritz hovered, torn between appealing to Wolfe's palate and respecting Wolfe's morning schedule. He tried diplomacy. "Mr. Wolfe, it is not mine. I do not know how anyone would change it. We do not have this American restaurant salt in the house." Wolfe sighed as if the paper had joined forces with Fritz to plot his murder. He folded it precisely and set it on the desk blotter, then cocked an eyebrow at the ramekin without deigning to reach for it. "Which salt was there?" "Fleur de sel de Guérande," Fritz said. "You approved the lot 6 months ago. The crystals are fragile and bright. This," he jabbed a finger at the bowl. "This is not fragile." "Then someone tampered," Wolfe said. "It is an indignity. Correct it." "I will," Fritz said. "But who would—" "That," Wolfe said, "is not my problem at 9:30 in the morning." It was a fair point. At 9:30, Wolfe is married to order. The orchids had been visited at 9. The 10 to 12 stretch is reserved for his mind. Any intrusion is a trespass not lightly forgiven. Fritz made a soft sound that meant he would forgive, but he would remember, then departed in search of kitchen justice. I looked at Wolfe. He looked at me. We both looked at the door as the bell rang. Wolfe closed his eyes. "If it's a salesman," he said, "you may have him arrested." I went to answer it, crossing the hall with the small, unfashionable thrill of being in a house that doesn't want company. The brownstone isn't misanthropic exactly. It just prefers its own company first, with an occasional guest who proves worthy. The woman waiting on our stoop was worthy of being there if the test was how to stand straight while the city swirled around her. She was in her early 30s, with dark hair that had been instructed and obeyed, gray eyes that measured you the way a jeweler does a watch chain, and a mouth that knew how not to smile. Her coat was good and her shoes were better. She carried a small wooden box under one arm and what looked like a paper portfolio under the other. "Archie Goodwin," she said, looking at me as if my features might be relevant later. "You win," I said. "Come in." She did, and I caught a whiff of something that wasn't perfume, cleaner and colder, like a winter pantry. She kept hold of the wooden box as if it might try to escape. I guided her into the office. Wolfe had decided against generosity. He was back to the paper. I introduced her anyway. "Mr. Wolfe, this is Iris Fenlow," she said. "I apologize for coming unannounced." I tried to call yesterday and was told Mr. Wolfe was not receiving engagements. I would have waited until next week if I could. Wolfe folded the paper again and set it aside with the look of a man granting a reprieve. He studied her as he might consider a new hybrid for the North Room. "Sit, Miss Fenlow." "Or Mrs.?" "Miss," she said, settling into the red leather chair. "I curate the collection at the Saporium." "The what?" I asked, because you can't be too careful. "The Saporium," she repeated. "A tasting library. We acquire and preserve edible materials of provenance for research and education. Vinegars, honeys, oils, salts." "Salts," Wolfe said. And I couldn't have proved it in court, but I heard the needle jump a hair. Miss Fenlow glanced at the wooden box and then at Wolfe. "Yes, that word may make me both laugh and cry for the rest of my life. May I put this on your desk?" Wolfe, whose desk is not a public thoroughfare, allowed it with a cool hand wave. She set the box down and opened it. Inside was a shallow ceramic dish, white and simple. Nestled in it were crystals like tiny clear pebbles. On the little ledge of the box was a folded card with a neat printed label. "Sel Gris, Lot 218A, 240 Gris." Fritz's sense of betrayal warmed in the back of my throat. Miss Fenlow said, "That is not Lot 218A. Wolfe didn't lean forward. He is against leaning. "You brought your problem to my house and to my desk, not to my doorstep. If I look at it, you will pay me to look at it. If I don't, we will save us both time. Which will you have?" She didn't flinch. "I'll pay you to look and to listen." "Terms," he said. "Your usual," she said, which is the sort of answer that makes you check the underbrush. People who know our usual terms tend to be either on the level or over it. "And a bonus of 5,000 if you can do it without the police ever knowing my name." Wolfe's lower lip pushed itself out. "Who sent you?" She allowed herself half a smile. "I sent me. But I asked Mr. Marco Vukic for your terms because I couldn't fetch up the nerve to speak to Fritz." Wolfe closed his eyes for a second as if giving thanks that Marco still operated under ancient law. He opened them again. "Proceed, Miss Fenlow." She touched the card with one finger, then drew it back as if not to contaminate it. "The Saporium's collection is private, by appointment, because we handle rare and delicate materials, and because donors like to be told their treasures are safe. We held a demonstration last Friday for a small group of board members and patrons. It's clever to teach them to taste, because when you teach a man to distinguish his gifts, he wants to keep giving." Wolfe nodded once. "True. We had 5 stations," she continued, "each with 3 samples. 1 baseline, 1 variant, 1 exceptional with notes. Vinegars, sugars, oils, tea, and salts. At the salt station, we had a local sea salt, a commodity kosher, and what should have been a gray sea salt with complex mineral expression. Lot 218A of our Brittany acquisition. It is one of our stars. I sourced it myself." Her voice didn't wobble, but the way her hands stayed still told me she had practiced that. "And it was not that salt," Wolfe said. "No," she said. "It looked close enough. It was not. It was coarse, yes, but blunt. It had anti-caking agents. It had rice grains." "Rice grains," Wolfe said. She blinked, adjusting to Wolfe's precision. "Yes, a few. That is customary in diners. Not in our collection. Someone had swapped the sample before we began." "Your guests noticed," Wolfe said. "One did," she said. "The chemist, Dr. Sylvie Corbett. She's a donor. She was kind enough to ask if perhaps our exceptional sample had been mislabeled. Then Mr. Voss, Leland Voss, our interim director, said perhaps we were having fun with them. I assured them we were not. Mr. Voss laughed. Dr. Corbett did not. She was stern. I was humiliated. "You could have announced the substitution," I said. "It would have made a more memorable afternoon." "I'm trying to keep my job," she said without looking at me. "Ah," Wolfe said. There it is. She lifted her chin. The next morning, I went to the storage room. The museum-grade jars were intact and properly sealed. Their lot numbers and tamper-evident bands were undisturbed. But the demonstration kit, we assembled those ourselves, was touched. The salt was wrong. The card was my handwriting, but the little pinhook I used to hang the tag was bent. Someone had swapped only the item on display. Who has access to the storage room? I asked. 8 people in theory, she said. In practice, about 4. She didn't give me the names. That was fine. It meant she knew some rules. Wolfe was watching her, not the salt dish. And why are you here? Because of this, she said, and slid the folded card toward him. There was a note under the foam of the box when I put it back. Not in the storage room, in the demonstration box. No one but me and my assistant Evan handled that box after the tasting. I opened the card. Inside was a small square of white paper, torn from a pad with machine-like neatness. On it, typed with the precision of an old typewriter, were 3 words. Consider yourself seasoned. Subtle, I said. She ignored me. Wolfe hadn't moved, but something in the air had shifted. Fritz's treason in the salt cellar had been household business. This was something else. Wolfe looked at the dish, then the note. He did not touch either. This is petty, he said. Petty acts are usually personal acts. You have an enemy. I have colleagues, she said. That's the polite word. What are the impolite names? I asked. She didn't smile. I could give you people instead. Leland Voss, our interim director. He would like the position to become permanent, and he would like me to remain curatorial and quiet. Celia Merritt, our youngest fellow. She has talent and speed and thinks patience is a con trick. Anton Karlik, a spice importer who donates in exchange for visibility. He is generous when seen. Dr. Sylvie Corbett, who is very clever and prefers it when other people are not. And Evan Broom, my assistant, who is loyal to the idea of being loyal. That is 5, Wolfe said. It is enough for a start. She looked at the salt dish. You will say it is beneath you. Please take my money and indulge me. Wolfe's mouth adjusted fractionally, which in another man would be called a smile. Miss Fenlow, nothing that meddles with the integrity of the table is beneath me. However, he settled back. I will not move, and I do not stoop. I will look, and I will have Mr. Goodwin look. You will answer questions, and you will do as I tell you, if you retain me. If you do not, you will leave the note and the dish here and depart. If you do, you will write a check. Which is it? She didn't glance at me, which I appreciated. I retain you, she said, and reached for her purse. By the time she had written the check, Wolfe had his daily schedule aligned like chess pieces. He glanced at the clock, 20 minutes to 10. Theodore would be expecting him among the orchids at 11. Mr. Goodwin, he said, you will accompany Miss Fenlow to the Soporium this afternoon and look. Until then, listen. Miss Fenlow, enumerate for him the points of entry, the locks and their keys, the procedures for assembling your kits, and your schedule this week past. Begin with Friday, and do not omit meals. Food is often the only truthful timeline in a day. She didn't bridle, which put a point in her column. I brought a copy of our access logs, she said, opening the paper portfolio, and the guest list for Friday, with times of arrival and departure. I also printed the security camera map. Does the security camera point at where the kits are assembled? I asked. No, she said. We point away from things that donors think are ugly. Wolfe barked, his version of a laugh that has decided to remain private. He swiveled his head an inch and sniffed the air near the dish. Who packaged the kits? Evan and I assembled them in the prep room, she said. We do it on Thursdays. The storage room is separate and locked. We only bring out the portion we need. Where did you keep the assembled salt kit between Thursday and Friday? Wolfe asked. In my office, she said. On the credenza behind the desk. I locked the door. I took the kit to the demonstration room at 1 o'clock on Friday. We stood. She gathered her things, her hand cool and dry when she passed me her card. There is one more thing, she said at the door. Last night I found that my personal container of sel de noir moutier had been moved. Not used. Moved. I measured. Measured, I said. You and Fritz should join a club. She let a smile slip loose. Tasting makes you careful. Or makes you paranoid, I said. Both, Wolfe said. Mr. Goodwin will call you at 2. Do not speak of this to anyone you don't have to, which is everyone except the 5 you named, and even then, you do not confide. You inform. She went. I closed the door behind her and turned to find Wolfe gazing at the dish like a general regarding a map. He still hadn't touched it. Petty, I said. Petty, he agreed, and therefore dangerous. A thief will often be practical. A vandal almost never is. I looked at the note again. Consider yourself seasoned. It was a joke, and jokes make people underestimate the jokers. You're taking it, I said. I have taken it. Because she is. I waggled my hand, thinking of her intelligence, her composure, her refusal to be intimidated. Because someone sprinkled derision over a table, he said, and that was Wolfe. Because I will not have it, and because we have been trespassed on. Fritz is ramekin, and this house is immunity, he said. We live by rules here. When rules decay, the palate is the first to know. He reached for the bell chain. Fritz answered as if he had been waiting, which he had. You will replace the salts, Wolfe told him, and the pepper while you're at it. You will check your stores. Nothing in a vessel that has not been sealed. Fritz looked at the dish on the desk and made a tiny noise, which roughly translated to may lightning strike that which is faithless. Thank you, he said, and withdrew. Wolfe leaned back as if life had rearranged itself to fit his chair. At 2 o'clock, he told me, you will go to the Soporium and you will not, under any circumstance, express an opinion until you have one. Bring me names, times, and any fool's laughter you hear. He closed his eyes. The morning had resumed its peace with 2 new grains of grit in it. I stayed where I was for a minute, looking at the little clear pebbles in the dish and feeling the brownstone tighten around them, a shell expecting an irritant to turn into a pearl. At 11, the orchids would get him. At 2, the saporium would get me. In between, there was salt in the air and a sense that someone was having fun at the expense of order. That kind of person often finds out that the bill comes salted too. By noon, Fritz had restored order to his kingdom with the thoroughness of a general reclaiming occupied territory. The offending salt had been banished, the fleur de sel reinstated, and the pantry subjected to an inventory that would have impressed a Swiss banker. He moved through the kitchen with the satisfied air of a man who had personally defeated chaos and sent it packing. Wolfe had returned from the orchids at 11 and settled into his chair with a book on Byzantine taxation policies. Light reading that put him in an appropriately skeptical mood for dealing with the modern world. I was at my desk, making notes about Miss Fenlow's morning visit, when the doorbell announced our first uninvited guest of the day. It was a delivery man with a package that looked like it had been wrapped by someone who understood the psychology of ribbons. The box was addressed to Fritz in careful script, with a return label reading Carlick & Sons Importers and tied with a burgundy satin ribbon that probably cost more than most people spend on lunch. Fritz accepted it with the wariness of a man who had learned not to trust unsolicited gifts, especially ones that arrived the morning after his salt had been tampered with. He carried it into the office and set it on the corner of Wolfe's desk with the delicacy of someone handling a suspicious package. I ordered nothing, he announced. Wolfe glanced at the box without moving his head more than necessary. Open it. Fritz untied the ribbon with the precision he brought to everything involving his kitchen, folded it neatly, and lifted the lid. Inside, nestled in tissue paper like precious stones, were 3 small glass jars with ground glass stoppers. Each bore a handwritten label in elegant script: Sel Gris, Noir Moutier, Pink Peruvian, and Kala Namak. The accompanying card read, "For the eminent table, compliments of Anton Karlik. A pleasure is multiplied by companions." Fritz lifted one jar and examined it with the eye of a man who could spot a counterfeit spice at 30 paces. He sniffed delicately at the stopper. "It appears genuine," he admitted, his voice carrying the reluctance of someone forced to acknowledge quality in an unwanted gift. "It is also unsolicited," Wolfe observed. "We will not be indebted to strangers bearing salt." "But Mr. Wolfe," Fritz said, holding up the jar of Kala Namak, "this is difficult to obtain in proper quality, and the Sel Gris—" "Put them in the pantry," Wolfe instructed. "Seal the stoppers with wax. You may thank Mr. Karlik for his generosity and purchase nothing from him. Ever." Fritz nodded and departed with the jars, understanding that gratitude and commerce were different currencies in Wolfe's economy. The house had barely settled back into its rhythm when the doorbell rang again. This time, it was the gift-giver himself. Anton Karlik stood on our stoop like a man who had never met a threshold he couldn't charm his way across. He was compact and elegant, with silver hair that looked like it had been styled by someone who understood the importance of first impressions. His suit whispered expensive, and his smile suggested he was prepared to be delighted by whatever happened next. "Mr. Goodwin," he said, extending a hand that felt like it had shaken many others in its time. "Anton Karlik, I hope my small gift arrived safely." "It did," I said, stepping aside to let him in. "Mr. Wolfe is in his office." I led him down the hall, noting the way he took in the details of the house. The Persian rug, the quality of the woodwork, the subtle signs of a place where money was spent on things that mattered rather than things that impressed. When we entered the office, Wolfe looked up from his book with the expression of a man greeting a necessary interruption. "Mr. Wolfe," Karlik said, stopping just inside the room's boundaries with the instinct of someone who understood territorial rules. "A privilege I have long desired. Marko Vukic speaks of you with great respect, and your Fritz, what artistry. I have wanted to provide your household with a small token of my admiration." "You have provided it," Wolfe said. "State your business." Karlik's smile flickered but held. He settled into the red leather chair with the fluid grace of a man comfortable in other people's spaces. "Direct. I appreciate that. You have been visited by Miss Fenlow, I assume?" "You assume correctly." "Then you know about Friday's unfortunate incident at the Saporium." Karlik's eyes found the ceramic dish still sitting on Wolfe's desk. "A regrettable business. Bad for everyone involved." "Including you?" I asked. "Especially me," he said. "I donate to the Saporium. I provide samples for their collection. When their demonstrations become embarrassments, it reflects poorly on the quality of what I supply, even when the embarrassment has nothing to do with my products." "You were there Friday?" Wolfe asked. "Briefly. I make appearances at these events. Visibility is important in my business, but I left before the difficulties became apparent." He paused, studying Wolfe's impassive face. "I understand there was a substitution. Inferior salt replacing one of their premium samples. With rice grains," I added, watching his reaction. Karlik's mouth tightened almost imperceptibly. "Ah, yes. The rice. A common adulterant in commercial salt, used to prevent clumping. I stopped using it in my products years ago when I learned that discriminating palates could detect it. It's a signature of cheap processing." "Whose signature?" Wolfe asked. "No one I would associate with," Karlik said. "But someone who wanted to make a point about quality, perhaps. Or someone who wanted to embarrass Miss Fenlow specifically." "Why Miss Fenlow specifically?" Karlik shrugged elegantly. "She is particular about her standards. Some people find such particularity threatening, or they find it pretentious. In either case, they might wish to demonstrate that even experts can be fooled." The doorbell rang again. I excused myself and found Leland Voss on our doorstep, looking like a man who had dressed for a board meeting and found himself at a crime scene instead. He was tall and lean, with the kind of careful grooming that suggested he spent considerable time thinking about the impression he made. "Mr. Goodwin," he said, his voice carrying the smooth authority of someone accustomed to being listened to. "Leland Voss, interim director of the Saporium. I believe we need to talk." I showed him to the office, where Karlik was still holding court in the red leather chair. The two men acknowledged each other with the kind of polite nods that suggested a history of professional necessity rather than personal warmth. "Anton," Voss said, "I didn't expect to find you here." "Leland," Karlik replied, "I came to clarify my position in this unfortunate matter. And you?" "To resolve it," Voss said, turning to Wolfe. "Mr. Wolfe, I'm here to discuss Miss Fenlow's concerns. I believe there's been a misunderstanding about the nature of Friday's incident." Wolfe closed his book and set it aside with the deliberate care of a man preparing for battle. "Explain the misunderstanding." Voss remained standing, perhaps thinking it gave him an advantage. "Miss Fenlow is an excellent curator, but she's under considerable pressure. The board is evaluating our leadership structure, and there are competing visions for the Saporium's future. I'm afraid this incident may be more about internal politics than actual sabotage." "You believe Miss Fenlow fabricated the substitution?" Wolfe asked. "Not fabricated, no, but perhaps misinterpreted. These things happen in institutional settings. Someone makes an error, and rather than admit it, they look for external explanations." "And the note?" I asked. "Consider yourself seasoned?" Voss hesitated for just a moment, long enough for me to notice, short enough for him to think I hadn't. "Office humor," he said. "We have a young fellow, Celia Merritt, who's known for her pranks. Harmless, really." "Harmless to whom?" Wolfe asked. "To everyone. It's just salt, Mr. Wolfe. Not a murder weapon." The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Wolfe's eyes fixed on Voss with the intensity of a man who had just heard heresy preached in his own church. "Just salt," Wolfe repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. "Well, yes. I mean, it's unfortunate that it happened during a public demonstration, but in the grand scheme of things—" "Mr. Voss," Wolfe interrupted, and something in his tone made both visitors straighten in their chairs. "In this house, there is no such thing as just salt. Salt is the foundation of flavor, the cornerstone of preservation, the difference between sustenance and starvation. When someone tampers with salt, any salt, anywhere, they tamper with one of humanity's most fundamental relationships with food." He paused, letting the words settle. "When they tamper with salt in my presence, they insult not just Miss Fenlow's expertise, but the very principle of culinary integrity. And when they suggest that such tampering is trivial, they reveal themselves to be either fools or villains." Voss's face had gone pale. "I didn't mean to suggest—" "You meant to suggest that I abandon my client for a fee," Wolfe continued, "that I accept your version of events without investigation, that I treat a deliberate act of sabotage as a clerical error." His voice grew quieter, more dangerous. "You meant to bribe me, Mr. Voss. I was offering to retain your services." "You were offering to purchase my betrayal," Wolfe said. "The distinction is not subtle." Karlik had been watching this exchange with the fascination of a man witnessing a master class in moral authority. Now he cleared his throat gently. "Perhaps, Leland, this is not the venue for such negotiations." Voss looked from Wolfe to Karlik to me, realizing that he had badly misjudged both the situation and the man he was dealing with. "I think there's been a misunderstanding." "There has been no misunderstanding," Wolfe said. "You have revealed yourself, Mr. Voss. You may leave." After Voss departed, with considerably less dignity than he had arrived with, Karlik finished his business quickly. He provided some useful information about the other players at the Saporium, accepted Wolfe's thanks for the gift with good grace, and took his leave with the air of a man who had learned something valuable about the household he was dealing with. When the house was quiet again, I looked at Wolfe, who had returned to his book but wasn't reading it. "Interesting morning," I said. "Instructive," he agreed. Mr. Voss confirmed that the stakes are higher than Miss Fenlow indicated. His willingness to bribe suggests desperation. His dismissal of the incident as trivial suggests guilt. And Carlick is a businessman who understands that reputation is currency. He gains nothing from this mischief and loses much if it continues. He may be useful. I made a note to follow up on Carlick's suggestion about talking to the assistant, Evan Broom. In my experience, assistants know where all the bodies are buried, and sometimes who buried them. The clock chimed 1. In the kitchen, Fritz was preparing lunch with the satisfied air of a man whose domain had been restored to proper order. The salt cellar held the correct salt, the pantry was secure, and the world was once again arranged according to his standards. But in the office, the ceramic dish with its alien crystals still sat on Wolfe's desk, a reminder that someone, somewhere, was playing games with the very foundations of taste itself. And in Nero Wolfe's universe, that was not just a crime, it was a declaration of war. "Principles, Archie," Wolfe said as if reading my thoughts. "When we abandon our principles for convenience, we discover that we have abandoned everything that makes convenience worthwhile." He opened his book again, but I noticed he kept one eye on that dish of counterfeit salt, as if it might try to escape when he wasn't looking. In the brownstone, even the evidence was expected to behave itself. At 1:30, Wolfe rang for Fritz and requested that Miss Fenlow be called. When she came on the line, he instructed her to provide detailed profiles of each suspect, beginning with their motives and ending with their access to the crime scene. I put her on speaker and prepared to take notes. "Begin with Mr. Voss," Wolfe said, settling back in his chair with the air of a man preparing to dissect a particularly complex recipe. Miss Fenlow's voice came through clearly, precise as always. "Leland Voss, 49, interim director for 11 months. He was brought in from the Manchester Museum after our founder retired. The board couldn't agree between a curatorial candidate and a growth candidate. Leland was the compromise. He's been consolidating power ever since." "Past encounter?" I asked. "A memorandum I wrote to the board about a proposed exhibit he wanted to sponsor. Salts paired with social media influencers. I cited conflict of interest and reputational risk. It leaked. He was civil about it, but I humiliated him publicly. He's made it clear he prefers I stick to curation and leave governance to him." "Motive is obvious," Wolfe observed. "Securing permanent appointment requires eliminating obstacles. Continue." She moved through the list methodically. Celia Merritt, the ambitious young fellow who thought the Saporium should embrace modern marketing. Dr. Sylvie Corbett, the chemist whose standards made Miss Fenlow look permissive. Anton Carlick, the importer whose donations came with expectations. And Evan Broom, the loyal assistant who might harbor quiet resentments. When she finished, I had 5 suspects with clear motives, but Wolfe wasn't satisfied with second-hand information. "Mr. Goodwin," he said, "you will go to the Saporium now and observe these people in their natural habitat. Note who moves where, who has access to what, and who displays the kind of nervous energy that suggests guilt." At 2:15, I stood in the lobby of the Saporium, a converted townhouse on East 74th Street that had been transformed into a temple of taste. The ground floor was all gleaming display cases and carefully lit exhibits. Bottles of aged vinegar arranged like fine wines, honeys from places that sounded mythical, and salts in every conceivable color and texture. The air carried the mingled scents of exotic spices and old wood, with an underlying note of something indefinably expensive. Miss Fenlow met me at the reception desk, looking composed but tense. "The staff is here for our weekly meeting," she explained. perfect timing for you to observe the dynamics. She led me through the main exhibition space toward a group of people clustered around a large table. The first to detach himself was Leland Voss, impeccably groomed and radiating the kind of professional charm that comes with practice. "Mr. Goodwin," he said, extending a hand with just the right amount of firmness. "Iris mentioned you'd be consulting on our little situation. I hope we can resolve this quickly and quietly. The board is quite concerned about maintaining our institutional reputation." His smile was perfect, his tone reasonable, but his eyes held the calculation of a man measuring threats. This was someone who thought in terms of optics and damage control, exactly the kind of person who might stage a public embarrassment to discredit a rival. "I'm sure we can sort it out," I said non-committally. Next came Dr. Sylvie Corbett, a compact woman in her 50s with steel-gray hair and the bearing of someone accustomed to being the smartest person in any room. She approached with the directness of a guided missile. "Mr. Goodwin," she said, her handshake crisp and businesslike, "I trust you're taking this matter seriously. What happened Friday was not just embarrassing. It was a deliberate attack on the scientific integrity of this institution." "You could tell that from the taste?" I asked. Her smile was sharp as a scalpel. "Mr. Goodwin, I have a PhD in analytical chemistry and 20 years in food science. That salt had anti-caking agents, rice starch, and a mineral profile that screamed industrial processing. Someone replaced artisanal cell grist with grocery store garbage. Any idea who would do such a thing?" She glanced meaningfully at Miss Fenlow. "There are people who would benefit from undermining Iris's credibility. The question is, which one was clever enough to plan it and bold enough to execute it?" Before I could pursue that, a young woman with wild auburn curls bounded over with the energy of someone who had never met a social boundary she couldn't leap over. "You must be the detective," Celia Merritt announced, her voice carrying across the room. "This is so exciting, like a real mystery, right here in our little salt library." "You think it's exciting?" I asked. "Well, sure. I mean, it's just salt, right? Someone played a prank, probably thought they were being clever with that consider yourself seasoned note. Pretty funny, actually." Miss Fenlow's face tightened. "It was not funny, Celia." "Oh, come on, Iris. Lighten up. It's not like anyone died. Besides, maybe it'll teach people not to take themselves so seriously." She winked at me conspiratorially. "Between you and me, some people around here could use a little seasoning." Her casual dismissal of the incident was either genuine thoughtlessness or carefully calculated misdirection. In my experience, people who insist something is just a prank are often the ones who planned it. The last member of our circle was Evan Broom, Miss Fenlow's assistant, who had been hovering at the edge of the group like a satellite afraid of falling out of orbit. He was slight and nervous, with the perpetually worried expression of someone who took his responsibilities very seriously. "Mr. Goodwin," he said, offering a soft handshake. "Miss Fenlow said you wanted to know about the demonstration preparation. I helped assemble the kits Thursday morning. We were very careful with the measurements and labeling." "Who else was in the building that day?" "Well, Mr. Voss was in and out. Dr. Corbett came by to collect samples for her research. Mr. Carlick made his usual rounds. He likes to check on his donations." He paused, glancing nervously at Dr. Corbett. "And there was some kind of delivery for Mr. Voss." "What kind of delivery?" Evan shrugged. "Just a package. The delivery man asked for Mr. Voss specifically." Dr. Corbett had been listening to this exchange with growing intensity. "Evan," she said, her voice sharp, "you mentioned my research. Did you happen to see what samples I collected?" The young man flushed. I saw you in the storage room with some of the salt samples, and you had papers spread out on the counter." "What kind of papers?" I asked. Dr. Corbett's jaw tightened. "Correspondence related to my current project. I'm preparing a research paper on authenticity in artisanal salt marketing." Some of what's being sold as rare and handcrafted is actually common industrial product with fancy labels and inflated prices. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Miss Fenlow looked startled. Celia suddenly found her shoes fascinating, and Evan appeared to be trying to disappear entirely. That research would be uncomfortable for some people, I observed. It would be devastating for some people, Dr. Corbett corrected, including some of our most generous donors. The pieces were falling into place. Dr. Corbett's research threatened to expose fraud in the artisanal food world. Miss Fenlow's expertise and integrity made her a natural ally for such research, or a natural target for anyone who wanted to discredit her before she could support Dr. Corbett's findings. Dr. Corbett, I said, do you think Friday's incident was connected to your research? I think someone wanted to demonstrate that even experts can be fooled, that even the most careful curator can be made to look incompetent. Her eyes glittered with cold intelligence. It was a warning shot, Mr. Goodwin. The question is whether Iris will heed the warning or fight back. I spent another hour at the Soporium, examining the prep room where the kits had been assembled, the storage areas where the authentic samples were kept, and Miss Fenlow's office where the demonstration kit had supposedly been secured overnight. The security was adequate, but not foolproof. Plenty of opportunities for someone with access to make a substitution. By 4 o'clock, I had what I came for. A clear picture of 5 people with means, motive, and opportunity. Voss, who needed Miss Fenlow discredited to secure his position. Celia, who might see pranks as a form of institutional reform. Dr. Corbett, who could have staged the incident to justify her research or to pressure Miss Fenlow into supporting it. Carlick, who had the most to lose if fraud allegations gained credibility. And Evan, the loyal assistant who might harbor secret resentments or be manipulated by others. When I returned to the brownstone, Wolfe was in his chair with a book on medieval spice routes, looking as if he had never moved since I left. I settled at my desk and gave him a complete report, including the revelation about Dr. Corbett's fraud research. Interesting, he said when I finished. The salt substitution was not merely vandalism, it was strategic. Someone wanted to undermine Miss Fenlow's credibility before she could become an inconvenient ally to Dr. Corbett's research. Or Dr. Corbett staged it herself to create urgency around her project, I suggested. Possible, Wolfe conceded. But the note suggests personal animosity, not professional calculation. Consider yourself seasoned implies familiarity and contempt. So we're looking for someone who knows Miss Fenlow well enough to dislike her personally, but also has a professional reason to want her discredited. Precisely, Wolfe said. And someone with access to both authentic and counterfeit salt. The substitution required advanced planning and specific materials. He closed his book and looked at the ceramic dish still sitting on his desk, its alien crystals catching the afternoon light. We have our circle of suspects, Archie. Now we must determine which one had the knowledge, the opportunity, and the particular combination of malice and calculation required to commit this act. Any preferences? None, he said. But I have expectations. Tomorrow, we will apply pressure to see who reacts most strongly. In my experience, guilty parties often reveal themselves when they believe they are being clever. The clock chimed 5. In the kitchen, Fritz was preparing dinner with the satisfaction of a man whose salt was exactly what it claimed to be. But in the office, the mystery of the substituted crystals remained unsolved, a grain of deception in the otherwise orderly world of the brownstone. Patience, Archie, Wolfe said, as if reading my thoughts. Salt has been preserving things for thousands of years. Our criminal will keep until we're ready to cure them. He opened his book again, but I noticed he kept glancing at that dish of counterfeit salt as if it might suddenly confess its origins. In Nero Wolfe's world, even the evidence was expected to behave with proper decorum. But this particular evidence was proving as stubborn as the person who had planted it. Wednesday morning, Wolfe handed me a list written on his personal stationery in his careful script. 6 items that looked deceptively simple until you considered what they actually required. "Your assignments," he said, settling back with his coffee. First, who had access to Miss Fenlow's office between Thursday noon and Friday 1 o'clock? Second, the precise whereabouts and timeline of Mr. Broom's missing keys. Third, the Thursday delivery to Mr. Voss, sender, contents, and timing. Fourth, which of our suspects maintains a typewriter capable of producing that note? Fifth, where one might acquire coarse salt with rice additives within walking distance of the Saporium. Sixth, any unearned laughter you encounter. And if I can't get all 6, bring me the laughter, he said. It will tell us more than alibis. I started with the Saporium's building superintendent, a compact man named Gustavo, who had the watchful eyes of someone who noticed everything and trusted very little. His basement office was a monument to practical efficiency. Key hooks labeled with surgical precision, security logs bound in chronological order, and a coffee pot that looked like it had been brewing the same batch since the Coolidge administration. "Access to Miss Fenlow's office?" I asked. "She has her key. Mr. Voss has a master, I have a master, and security has one for emergencies," he said, counting on thick fingers. "Building policy requires 2-person authorization for after-hours entry, but..." He shrugged expressively. "But Mr. Voss doesn't always follow building policy. He called Thursday evening, said he needed special access for board materials. I let him in at 7, came back to lock up at 8:15. He was gone." "Did you check which offices he'd been in?" Gustavo's smile was thin as paper. His office door was open, Miss Fenlow's was closed. Prep room was locked. I don't ask questions I don't want answered. "And the assistant's keys?" "Young Mr. Broom? Lost them Wednesday. Found them Thursday morning in his coffee mug. Didn't report it until Friday." His expression suggested what he thought of such carelessness. "I changed the prep room lock Friday afternoon. Can't have keys wandering around like tourists." My next stop was Dr. Sylvie Corbett's laboratory at Columbia, a sterile temple where science worshipped at the altar of precision. She received me in her office, surrounded by towers of research papers and the kind of equipment that could probably detect fraud in a grain of sand. "Mr. Goodwin," she said, gesturing to a chair that had been designed by someone who believed comfort was a character weakness. "I assume you want to discuss the elephant in the room, or should I say, the salt in the jar. Tell me about your fraud research." Her eyes lit up with the fervor of a true believer. "It's endemic, Mr. Goodwin. Absolutely endemic. I've tested samples from premium importers across the city, and the results are staggering. Industrial salt being sold as artisanal, with markups of 3,000% or more." She pulled out a thick folder and spread several sheets of analytical data across her desk. The charts meant nothing to me, but her passion was unmistakable. "Take this sample," she said, pointing to a graph covered with peaks and valleys. "Sold as hand-harvested Celtic sea salt, aged in traditional wooden vessels. The mineral profile shows it was processed in an industrial facility, probably in New Jersey. They're charging $40 a pound for salt that costs them 60 cents to produce. And Anton Karlik," her expression hardened, "one of the worst offenders. His Himalayan pink contains artificial coloring. His Mediterranean sea salt has never seen the Mediterranean. It's rock salt from a mine in Pennsylvania, processed with anti-caking agents and dyed to look authentic. Does Miss Fenlow know about this? I've been trying to tell her for months, but she's been diplomatically evasive. She doesn't want to alienate major donors, particularly ones who contribute as generously as Karlik does. But Mr. Goodwin, if my research goes public with the Saporium's endorsement, it will destroy several businesses overnight, including Karlik's, especially Karlik's, which is why I found Friday's incident so troubling. Someone wanted to discredit Iris before she could support my findings, make her look incompetent, and suddenly her endorsement becomes worthless. I made careful notes about Dr. Corbett's research timeline and asked about her whereabouts Thursday evening. She provided a detailed account of laboratory work, complete with security card timestamps. Either she was telling the truth, or she was the most thorough liar I'd encountered in years. Do you own a typewriter, Dr. Corbett? A 1958 Hermes Baby. Green. Excellent for labels when the computer system fails. She paused, studying my face. The E key has a small bruise, a manufacturing flaw that's been there for decades. Would you like to see it? She led me to a side table where the little green typewriter sat like a mechanical pet. I had her type a sample sentence. The letter E showed a distinct mark at the bottom, nothing like the clean, even strike on the note we'd found. My next interview was with Celia Merritt, whom I found in the Saporium's Fellows Room, surrounded by art supplies and what appeared to be the remnants of several ambitious projects. She looked up from a manual typewriter with the bright smile of someone who found the whole situation delightfully absurd. "The detective returns," she announced. "Come to interrogate my poor little Olympia." The typewriter was cream-colored and looked like it had been rescued from an estate sale. I asked her to type a sample and immediately noticed that the letter E had a small chip at the top, creating a distinctive mark on every impression. "Bought it last month," she said cheerfully. "Perfect for my analog authenticity project. Though I suppose it's not much good for anonymous notes, is it? That chip makes it rather identifiable." "Where were you Thursday evening?" "Yoga class until 8. Then back here to collect my laptop. I saw Gustavo's cleaning cart in the hallway. Why? You think I'm capable of salt-based terrorism?" Her casual dismissal of the incident was either genuine thoughtlessness or carefully calculated misdirection. In my experience, people who insist something is just a prank are often the ones who planned it. Leland Voss received me in his office with the practiced charm of a man accustomed to managing difficult conversations. His desk was immaculate, except for a folded delivery box tucked discreetly beside his credenza. When I dropped my pen and bent to retrieve it, I caught a glimpse of the packing slip. Denton Printing and Office Supply, 2 cases promotional brochures, 1 universal typewriter ribbon, black-red. "Hard week," he said, offering coffee I didn't want. "I hope you're making progress toward a swift resolution. The board is quite concerned about our institutional reputation. I understand you ordered some supplies Thursday." His smile flickered for just a moment. "New membership brochures. We're launching a premium tier, and a ribbon for the executive assistant's calculator. It's an older model that requires them." "Your assistant uses a MacBook," I observed. "We keep backup equipment," he said smoothly. "One can't be too prepared. You were here Thursday evening after hours. Board materials require quiet concentration. I had Gustavo let me in for an hour or so." "And you didn't go near Miss Fenlow's office?" "I had no reason to. My business was entirely administrative." But there was something in his tone that suggested he was choosing his words very carefully. I made a mental note to verify his timeline with Gustavo. My final formal interview was with Evan Broom, whom I found at his meticulously organized desk, looking like a man carrying the weight of institutional responsibility on his narrow shoulders. He glanced up nervously when I approached, as if expecting bad news. "The keys," I said without preamble. He flushed. "I lost them Wednesday evening. I thought I lost them. I retraced my steps, checked everywhere. The next morning, they were in my coffee mug. I didn't tell Miss Fenlow immediately because I didn't want to worry her before the demonstration." "Who knew about the missing keys?" "No one, initially. But Celia asked to borrow them Thursday evening. She'd left something in the prep room. I had to tell her I couldn't help because I'd misplaced them. She seemed annoyed." "Annoyed how?" "She said something about the Saporium being run like a prison with everyone afraid of their own shadows. Then she asked if there was another way into the prep room." "What did you tell her?" "That she'd have to wait until Friday morning." Security. Policy is very clear about after-hours access. I spent the remainder of the afternoon conducting what I call productive loitering, positioning myself where I could observe the suspect's natural behavior. The most interesting moment came when I returned to Miss Fenlow's office for one final look at the credenza where the salt kit had been stored. Above the credenza hung a framed certificate for curatorial excellence, and it was slightly askew. Not enough to be obvious, but enough for someone with an eye for detail to notice. It was the kind of displacement that might occur if someone had been reaching behind or around the credenza, perhaps while accessing something stored there. When I returned to the brownstone at 6, Wolfe was in his chair with a glass of beer and the satisfied expression of a man who had spent his day thinking productively while others did the legwork. "Report," he said. I gave him a complete account of my interviews and observations, including the typewriter evidence, the delivery records, and the various timeline inconsistencies I'd uncovered. When I finished, he sat in silence for several minutes, his eyes closed and his lips moving slightly as if he were tasting the information. "Interesting," he finally said. Mr. Voss ordered a typewriter ribbon Thursday and was alone in the building that evening with access to Miss Fenlow's office. Miss Merritt's typewriter has a distinctive chip that would make it unsuitable for anonymous correspondence. Dr. Corbett's machine shows a different flaw entirely. And Mr. Broom's missing keys created an opportunity that several people knew about. So which one did it? The one who understood that this was not merely vandalism, but strategic preparation for a larger battle. He opened his eyes and looked at me. The one who needed Miss Fenlow discredited before Dr. Corbett's research could gain institutional support. The one who had means, opportunity, and a typewriter that could produce clean, anonymous text. He reached for his beer, but I noticed his gaze lingered on the ceramic dish with its counterfeit crystals, as if he were already planning their confession. "Tomorrow, Archie, we will apply pressure to see who reacts most strongly. In my experience, guilty parties often reveal themselves when they believe they are being clever." The brownstone settled into its evening quiet, but the mystery remained as stubborn as the salt crystals sitting on Wolfe's desk, a mute witness to someone's carefully planned deception. Thursday morning brought the kind of crisp October air that usually puts Fritz in an excellent mood, but when he appeared in the office doorway at 8:30, his face carried the expression of a man who had discovered heresy in his own cathedral. In his hands, he held a small, elegant tin with a hinged lid, one I recognized as containing his prized Sarawak black pepper, a rare variety he sourced directly from a trusted importer in Malaysia and guarded like a state secret. "It has been violated," he announced, his voice tight with controlled outrage. Wolfe, who had been examining his morning mail with the methodical precision of a man sorting diamonds, looked up with the sharp attention he reserved for genuine crises. "Explain." Fritz set the tin on the desk with the reverence of a man handling evidence of sacrilege. 3 grams of the Sarawak pepper. Gone. Taken between last evening and this morning. You are certain of the amount? "I weigh and record every use," Fritz said, producing a small notebook from his apron pocket. "Yesterday, after preparing the lamb, the tin contained exactly 31.4 grams. This morning, 28.4 grams. 3 grams, precisely." Wolfe's eyes narrowed to slits. The Sarawak pepper wasn't just expensive. It was irreplaceable, a specific lot that Fritz had acquired through a network of connections that had taken years to cultivate. To steal 3 grams was to demonstrate not just access to the brownstone's most secure areas, but intimate knowledge of what would wound Fritz most deeply. "The spice cabinet was locked?" I asked, though I knew the answer. "Locked and undisturbed," Fritz confirmed. "No signs of forced entry. The key never left my person." He paused, his face darkening. "But there is more." He led us to the kitchen where his spice cabinet stood open like a violated sanctuary. Inside, everything appeared normal. Dozens of small containers arranged with military precision, each labeled in Fritz's careful script. but Fritz pointed to a barely visible disturbance in the dust pattern on one shelf. "Someone moved the cardamom to reach the pepper," he said. "Replaced it carefully, but not perfectly. And here." He indicated a small smudge on the cabinet's interior light switch. "A fingerprint that is not mine." Wolfe studied the cabinet with the intensity of a general surveying a battlefield. They knew exactly what they wanted and where to find it. This was not random theft. "It was a message," I said. "Like the salt in your ramekin, but more personal." "Indeed," Wolfe agreed, his voice carrying the cold edge that meant someone had made a serious mistake. Someone wished to demonstrate that no corner of this house is beyond their reach. The phone rang, interrupting our contemplation of domestic treachery. Miss Fenlow's voice came through with barely controlled urgency. "Mr. Wolfe, there's been a development. Can you see me this morning?" "State the nature of the development." "Someone was in my office at the Saporium last night. Nothing was taken, but my files were disturbed. Research notes, correspondence with Dr. Corbett, documentation about our authentication procedures, all of it examined and photographed." "How do you know they were photographed?" "Coffee stains," she said grimly. "Fresh ones in identical patterns on several documents. Someone was drinking while they worked, and my filing system was altered. Papers returned in alphabetical order instead of chronological." Wolfe's eyebrows rose fractionally. "You have not called the police?" "Mr. Voss insisted we wait until after the board meeting this afternoon. He said we needed to assess the scope of any potential damage before involving outside authorities." "How convenient for Mr. Voss," I observed. "That's what I thought," Miss Fenlow said. "Mr. Wolfe, I believe whoever did this also has access to your house. The timing is too precise to be coincidental." After she hung up, Wolfe sat in contemplative silence, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. The violation of the brownstone had been subtle but unmistakable, a demonstration of capability rather than mere vandalism. Combined with the Saporium intrusion, it painted a picture of someone with both sophisticated planning skills and intimate knowledge of their targets. "Fritz," Wolfe said finally, "examine this office with the same precision you used in the kitchen. Note anything that has been moved, touched, or altered since yesterday evening." Fritz nodded and began his inspection with the thoroughness of a forensic scientist. Within minutes, he had identified 3 additional signs of intrusion. Wolfe's pen had been moved a quarter inch to the right. There were unfamiliar fingerprints on the handle of his beer opener, and most tellingly, a single grain of coarse salt, identical to the counterfeit crystals in the ceramic dish, had been left on the desk blotter. "They examined their handiwork," Wolfe observed with grim satisfaction. "Pride, Archie, the fatal flaw of the clever criminal." He reached for the bell to summon Fritz, then changed his mind and picked up the phone instead. "Saul Panzer," he said when the connection was made. "I require your immediate presence, and bring Fred Durkin." Within an hour, both operatives were seated in the office, their faces reflecting the seriousness of having been summoned on short notice. Wolfe briefed them with military precision, outlining the escalating pattern of violations and the 5 suspects who had both motive and opportunity. "This is no longer merely a client's problem," he told them, his voice carrying the authority of a general addressing his staff. "Someone has demonstrated the capacity for subtle intrusion and the willingness to make this personal. I want to know who had the opportunity to be in this neighborhood last evening, and I want to know which of our suspects has access to both authentic and counterfeit spices." "What about the Saporium break-in?" Saul asked. "Connected, certainly, but secondary," Wolfe replied. "The violation of this house is the primary offense. Everything else is tactics." He assigned Saul to conduct discreet surveillance of the suspects, focusing particularly on their movements the previous evening. Fred was tasked with investigating the source of the counterfeit salt and the coarse pepper, working backward from specialty food suppliers to identify who might have purchased such specific materials. "And the RI's typewriter," I reminded them. "Still relevant," Wolfe confirmed. "Someone with access to an old machine produced that note. But now we know they also have lock-picking skills or inside knowledge of security systems. After the operatives departed, the brownstone settled into a tense quiet, like a fortress preparing for siege. Fritz returned to his kitchen with the grim determination of a man whose domain had been violated. Wolfe retreated behind his book, but I could see his mind working, processing the escalating pattern of provocations. "They're getting bolder," I observed. "And more careless," Wolfe replied without looking up. The pepper theft was unnecessary if their goal was simply to intimidate Miss Fenlow. It was personal, a direct challenge to this household's security and my reputation. So what's their endgame? To force Miss Fenlow into a position where she cannot support Dr. Corbett's fraud research, either through professional discrediting or personal intimidation. But they have made the mistake of involving us directly. His eyes glittered with cold satisfaction. That was their error. The ceramic dish of counterfeit salt sat on his desk like a declaration of war, its alien crystals catching the morning light. But now it was joined by the violated pepper tin and the knowledge that someone had walked through our home, touched our possessions, and left their mark like a calling card. In Nero Wolfe's universe, such trespasses demanded not just justice, but a demonstration that the sanctity of the brownstone was not to be violated with impunity. The game had become personal, and that meant the gloves were coming off. "Tomorrow, Archie," Wolfe said, closing his book with decisive finality, "we will gather our suspects and apply the appropriate pressure. Someone will break, and when they do, we will be ready." The house settled around us with the quiet tension of a place that had been marked by an enemy. But it was also the quiet of a place preparing its defenses, marshaling its resources, and planning its counterattack. Someone had made the mistake of bringing the war to Nero Wolfe's doorstep. They were about to discover what a serious error that had been. By Friday morning, the brownstone had acquired the tense quiet of a fortress under siege. Fritz moved through his domain with the rigid precision of a sentry, his eyes constantly scanning for signs of further violation. The kitchen, usually his sanctuary of order and creativity, now felt like a command post where every spice jar was a potential casualty and every unlocked cabinet a breach in the defenses. I found Wolfe at his desk at 8:30, ostensibly reading his morning paper, but actually brooding over the ceramic dish of counterfeit salt that Fritz had returned to its place of dishonor. The violation of his pepper tin had struck deeper than the initial salt substitution. It was personal, intimate, a demonstration that no corner of his carefully ordered world was beyond reach. The phone shattered the morning's brittle peace. Miss Fenlow's voice came through with the strained control of someone operating on the edge of collapse. "Mr. Wolfe, it's gotten much worse. They've brought the war to my doorstep." "Explain," Wolfe said, his voice carrying the sharp attention of a general receiving battlefield reports. "I came home last night to find a package on my front steps, wrapped like a gift with a burgundy ribbon that looked expensive. Inside was a block of industrial rock salt, the coarse, ugly kind they use for de-icing roads, and a note. Contents of the note? Some things are better left buried." Her voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "Mr. Wolfe, this isn't about the Soporium anymore. This is about silencing me permanently." Wolfe's eyes closed, and I could see him processing the escalation. The playful mockery of "consider yourself seasoned" had given way to direct intimidation. Someone was applying systematic pressure, moving from professional embarrassment to personal threat. "There's more," Miss Fenlow continued. "Leland Voss has been conducting a whisper campaign with the board members. He's telling them I staged the entire salt incident to cover up my own incompetence, that my association with Dr. Corbett represents a conflict of interest that compromises our donor relationships. The emergency board meeting has been moved to this afternoon, and he's recommending my immediate suspension." Before Wolfe could respond, the phone rang on my line. Saul Panzer's voice carried the professional calm of a man delivering news that would complicate everyone's morning. "There was an incident at Dr. Corbett's laboratory last night," he reported. "Someone attempted to break in around midnight. Security guards spotted them trying to jimmy the lock, but they fled before backup arrived. Left behind another calling card, a grain of that same coarse salt, and a typed note. Some research should stay buried." "Description of the intruder?" I asked. "Medium height, dark clothing, professional work. No prints, no witnesses, except the guard who saw them from 50 yards. But here's the interesting part. I had surveillance on 4 of our 5 suspects last night. Voss was at a board dinner until 11, then home. Celia Merritt was at a gallery opening with dozens of witnesses. Evan Broom never left his apartment. Dr. Corbett was in her lab until the security rounds at 11. And Carlick? That's where it gets interesting. Dinner alone at his club until 10:30, then unaccounted for until after 1 in the morning. Wolfe opened his eyes, and I could see the pieces arranging themselves in his mind like ingredients in a complex recipe. "The pattern is clear," he said. "Systematic pressure applied to multiple targets within a compressed time frame. Someone is operating under severe time constraints." "There's more," Saul continued. "Fred traced the source of that rock salt. Someone made a large cash purchase at a commercial kitchen supply house Wednesday afternoon. Industrial-grade rock salt, anti-caking agents, specific types of rice starch. Asked for delivery to Miss Fenlow's address just before midnight." The audacity was breathtaking. Someone had purchased the very materials used to adulterate the Saporium salt, then delivered a menacing sample directly to Miss Fenlow's doorstep. It was escalation, intimidation, and mockery, all wrapped in a burgundy bow. "Fred's samples will be useful," Wolfe said. "Proceed to Miss Fenlow's residence immediately. Photograph everything. Collect the note, but do not disturb the salt block until the police can examine it." After Saul hung up, Wolfe sat in contemplative silence, his fingers drumming a slow rhythm on his desk. The morning light caught the alien crystals in the ceramic dish, turning them into tiny, accusatory eyes. "They've made it personal," I observed. "They have made it unforgivable," Wolfe corrected, his voice carrying the cold edge that meant someone had crossed a line from which there was no retreat. "When they violate the sanctity of Miss Fenlow's home, they violate the principle that a person's dwelling should be their sanctuary. When they threaten her livelihood through whisper campaigns and staged evidence, they attack the very foundation of professional integrity." He reached for the phone and dialed the Saporium's main number. When Leland Voss came on the line, Wolfe's voice carried the authority of a judge pronouncing sentence. "Mr. Voss, I understand you're conducting an emergency board meeting this afternoon regarding Miss Fenlow's employment." "That's correct," Voss replied, his tone carefully neutral. "The board has serious concerns about recent security breaches and their impact on our institutional reputation." "Then you should know that I have identified the person responsible for the salt substitution, the office intrusion, the threatening package delivered to Miss Fenlow's home, and the attempted break-in at Dr. Corbett's laboratory. I will be presenting my findings to the appropriate authorities at 11 o'clock this morning." The silence stretched long enough for me to count heartbeats. When Voss finally spoke, his carefully maintained composure had developed cracks. "That's excellent news, Mr. Wolfe. I assume you'll coordinate with our security team." "I will coordinate with Miss Fenlow and the police," Wolfe replied. "The criminal will be arrested, the fraud will be exposed, and justice will be served. I thought you should know before proceeding with your character assassination." He hung up without waiting for a response, then immediately called Miss Fenlow back. "The trap is set," he told her. "Within the hour, you will receive contact from the guilty party, either attempting to negotiate or preparing to flee. You will agree to meet them, and you will ensure that Mr. Panzer is present to witness whatever confession or incrimination follows." "And if they don't contact me?" "They will," Wolfe said with absolute certainty. Desperation makes poor strategists, Miss Fenlow. Our criminal has invested considerable time and effort in this campaign of intimidation. They will not abandon their investment without attempting to salvage it." After she hung up, Wolfe leaned back in his chair with the satisfied expression of a chess master who had just moved his queen into position for checkmate. The ceramic dish of counterfeit salt still sat on his desk, but now it seemed less like evidence and more like a trophy waiting to be claimed. "You're gambling that guilt and panic will force their hand," I said. "I'm counting on it," Wolfe replied. "Someone has spent weeks orchestrating this elaborate campaign, professional sabotage, personal intimidation, systematic pressure on multiple targets. They have revealed themselves to be both sophisticated and desperate. Such people cannot resist the urge to control the narrative when they believe it's slipping away from them." The brownstone settled into expectant silence, like a theater waiting for the final act to begin. Somewhere in the city, a guilty party was discovering that their carefully planned campaign of intimidation had become a trap of their own making. By 11 o'clock, we would have our confession. In Nero Wolfe's universe, justice was not just a principle, it was a promise carved in stone and seasoned with the salt of absolute certainty. At 10:15, the brownstone wasn't merely quiet, it was braced. The violation of Fritz's pepper tin had transformed the house from sanctuary to fortress, and Wolfe sat in his chair with the immovable authority of a general who had finally identified his enemy. The ceramic dish of counterfeit salt remained on his desk like a declaration of war, but now it was joined by the knowledge that someone had walked through his home, touched his possessions, and left their mocking signature in his spice cabinet. Wolfe made 3 calls that would have sounded routine to a casual observer, but were nothing of the kind. The first was to Inspector Kramer, delivered with the precision of a man who had already calculated the endgame. "I will not trifle with your schedule, Mr. Kramer. This evening at 7:30, I will have in my office the person responsible for a calculated sequence of criminal trespasses, fraud, and intimidation. If you prefer to be present for the confession, you may. If not, you may collect the perpetrator afterward. Choose." Kramer's response carried the familiar mixture of skepticism and curiosity that had characterized their relationship for years. "I'll be there, Wolfe. But this better not be another one of your elaborate theories." "It is not a theory," Wolfe replied. "It is a certainty." The second call went to Dr. Sylvie Corbett at her laboratory. "Doctor, seal your fraud research, every chart, every analysis, every preliminary conclusion, in a tamper-evident envelope. Write your initials across the flap and place it in. You're safe. At 5 this afternoon, Mr. Goodwin will collect it." "Why the urgency?" she asked, though her voice already carried the understanding of someone who had spent months documenting systematic deception. "Because your research has forced a desperate man into the open," Wolfe explained. "He will attempt one final gambit to silence you and Miss Fenlow. When that fails, he will have no choice but confession or flight." The third call was to Miss Fenlow herself. When she answered, Wolfe's voice carried the authority of a judge pronouncing sentence. "The trap is set. Within the hour, you will receive contact from Anton Karlik. He will propose a meeting, somewhere public but private. You will agree, but you will insist that any resolution must include my approval." "Karlik?" Miss Fenlow's voice sharpened with understanding. "You're certain?" "Absolutely certain," Wolfe confirmed. "Dr. Corbett's research threatens to expose his entire business as fraudulent. The salt substitution was designed to discredit you before you could provide institutional support for her findings. When that failed to drive you away, he escalated to direct intimidation." As if summoned by Wolfe's prediction, the phone rang 20 minutes later. Miss Fenlow's voice carried the breathless tension of someone who had just watched their world shift into focus. "He called," she reported. "Karlik wants to meet at the public library on 5th Avenue, the main reading room. He says he has information that could resolve everything quietly without involving authorities. He seemed desperate. He is desperate, Wolfe confirmed. Mr. Panzer will observe and record everything. When Karlik makes his offer, and he will offer a substantial bribe, you will tell him that any resolution must include my approval. That will force him to reveal the full scope of his criminal enterprise. I called Saul and Fred to coordinate the surveillance operation. Saul would position himself in the library to observe the meeting, while Fred would maintain exterior surveillance in case Karlik attempted to flee when his bribery failed. What exactly are we expecting? Saul asked. A confession disguised as a business proposition, Wolfe replied. Karlik built his reputation on authenticity and quality. Dr. Corbett's research proves that his entire operation is fraudulent. Industrial salt sold at artisanal prices with markups of thousands of %. He orchestrated this campaign to destroy Miss Fenlow's credibility before she could endorse Dr. Corbett's findings. While the operatives prepared for their mission, I called Dr. Corbett to inform her that her research had forced the guilty party into the open. Her reaction was immediate and vindicated. Karlik, she said, her voice sharp with confirmed suspicion. I should have known. His donations were always contingent on favorable publicity. When I started questioning the authenticity of his products, he must have realized his entire business model was threatened. What exactly did your research find? Systematic fraud across his entire product line, she replied without hesitation. His Himalayan pink salt contains artificial coloring. His Mediterranean sea salt is industrial rock salt from Pennsylvania with added minerals to simulate authentic profiles. His artisanal black Hawaiian salt is regular salt mixed with activated charcoal. He's been selling pennies worth of industrial product for artisanal prices, probably making 3,000% profit. At 1 o'clock, Saul called from the library. Target acquired, he reported in his economical style. Karlik arrived 10 minutes early, chose a corner table, looks like a man heading to his own execution. Miss Fenlow just arrived. He's opening with apologies and concern for her welfare. Document everything, I instructed, particularly any specific admissions about the incidents. 20 minutes later, Saul called back. It's over. He offered her $50,000 to withdraw the complaint, dismiss your investigation, and publicly attribute the salt incident to a junior staff error. When she insisted on your approval, he got desperate, started admitting things, said the unfortunate incidents had gotten out of hand, that he never intended for things to escalate to break-ins and threatening packages. He practically confessed to the whole campaign. Did he admit to the brownstone violation? Not directly, but he said he hoped she understood that certain demonstrations of capability were meant to show the seriousness of the situation, not to cause actual harm. Miss Fenlow handled it perfectly, expressed shock at the implications and said she couldn't possibly interfere with a police investigation. His reaction? Panic. He realized he'd revealed too much. Started backpedaling, but the damage was done. He left looking like a man who knows the walls are closing in. When I returned to the brownstone, Wolfe was in his chair with the satisfied expression of a chess master who had successfully maneuvered his opponent into checkmate. The ceramic dish still sat on his desk, but now it seemed less like evidence and more like a trophy waiting to be claimed. The net is drawn, he announced. Karlik has revealed himself through desperation and hubris. His attempt at bribery has failed. Dr. Corbett's research will proceed with Miss Fenlow's institutional support, and he faces the choice between voluntary confession and criminal prosecution. What if he chooses to run? Then he confirms his guilt and destroys his reputation permanently, Wolfe replied with cold satisfaction. Either way, justice is served. At 4 o'clock, I collected Dr. Corbett's sealed research from her laboratory. The envelope was thick with documentation, initialed across the flap with strokes that looked like wire. Don't let him escape justice, she said as I left. He's been stealing from consumers and damaging the entire artisanal food industry for years. Back at the brownstone, Fritz was preparing the office for the evening's confrontation with the precision of a man arranging a courtroom. Chairs were positioned with mathematical accuracy. The air was cleared of any distracting scents, and the evidence. The ceramic dish of counterfeit salt and the violated pepper tin was arranged on Wolfe's desk like exhibits in a trial. At 6 o'clock, Wolfe made his final call of the day. When Karlik answered, his voice carried the strained courtesy of a man who knew his time was running out. "Mr. Karlik," Wolfe said, "a courtesy. Inspector Kramer will be present this evening. If you have the poor judgment to attempt flight, you will be arrested in circumstances far less dignified than a voluntary appearance. Your choice." The silence stretched long enough to count heartbeats. When Karlik finally spoke, his voice carried the defeat of a man who had played his last card and lost. "What time?" he asked. 7:30, Wolfe replied. "Come prepared to tell the truth." As evening approached, the brownstone settled into the expectant quiet of a place where justice was being carefully measured and prepared for serving. The mystery that had begun with a grain of counterfeit salt was about to conclude with a confession that would restore order to both the saporium and the sanctity of Wolfe's table. In Nero Wolfe's universe, that was not just justice. It was the natural order of things, as inevitable as salt dissolving in water, and as certain as the rising of the sun over West 35th Street. "Patience, Archie," Wolfe said, settling back in his chair with the satisfaction of a man whose trap had been perfectly set. "The guilty party will arrive punctually. Desperation, I have found, is remarkably prompt." By 7:15, the office had been transformed into a tribunal. Fritz had arranged the chairs with the precision of a stage manager preparing for the final act of a complex drama. The red leather chair sat in the position of honor or dishonor, depending on one's perspective. The ceramic dish of counterfeit salt commanded the center of Wolfe's desk like a silent prosecutor, its alien crystals catching the lamplight with accusatory gleam. Beside it, the small, violated pepper tin served as a reminder that this case had become deeply personal. Wolfe occupied his chair with the immovable authority of a judge who had weighed the evidence and found it sufficient. He had changed into his finest yellow shirt for the occasion, not from vanity, but from the understanding that justice, like a perfectly prepared meal, deserved proper ceremony. Inspector Kramer arrived first, punctual and skeptical, his bulk filling the doorway as he surveyed the assembled furniture with the wary eye of a man who had witnessed too many of Wolfe's theatrical revelations. He settled into his customary position near the door, close enough to observe every face, positioned to block any attempted escape. "This better not be another one of your elaborate theories, Wolfe," he growled, though his notebook was already open and his pen ready. "It is not a theory," Wolfe replied with the calm certainty of a man stating mathematical facts. "It is a demonstration of how desperation and greed can transform a successful businessman into a common criminal." Miss Fenlow entered next, composed but carrying the weight of systematic intimidation in her bearing. She took her seat with quiet dignity, her eyes immediately finding the ceramic dish with a mixture of recognition and revulsion. Dr. Corbett followed, her presence radiating the controlled intensity of a scientist who had spent months documenting fraud and was finally prepared to see justice served. Leland Voss arrived attempting to project confident professionalism, though the slight tremor in his hands and the sheen of perspiration on his forehead betrayed his underlying anxiety. He greeted Miss Fenlow with strained cordiality that made the air crackle with tension, then positioned himself where he could observe both Wolfe and the door. Celia Merritt bounced in with her characteristic energy, seemingly oblivious to the gravity of the situation, or perhaps performing obliviousness with calculated precision. Her bright demeanor provided jarring contrast to the room's solemnity, though I noticed her eyes linger on the evidence displayed on Wolfe's desk with something more thoughtful than curiosity. Evan Broom entered last, clutching his worn leather satchel like a shield, his nervous energy filling the remaining space in the room. He seemed to shrink into his chair, as if hoping to become invisible through sheer force of will. At 7:32, Anton Karlish appeared in the doorway. His usual elegant composure had been replaced by brittle control that threatened to shatter at the slightest pressure. His eyes went immediately to the salt dish, then to Wolfe, a flicker of defiance quickly giving way to calculation as he assessed the assembled company. "Mr. Karlick," Wolfe said without rising. "Sit down." Karlick moved to the remaining chair with mechanical precision, his movements those of a man following a script he had not written. The room fell silent, except for the barely audible sound of breathing and the scratch of Kramer's pen as he prepared to document whatever confession was about to unfold. "Gentlemen, ladies," Wolfe began, his voice carrying the authority of a prosecutor addressing a jury. "We are gathered because a series of calculated aggressions have been perpetrated against individuals and institutions, culminating in a direct affront to the integrity of this house." He gestured toward the ceramic dish. "It began with this. A simple substitution designed to undermine the credibility of Miss Fenlow and the Saporium. Some might dismiss it as a prank, but deliberate acts of sabotage are rarely isolated incidents. They are typically the opening moves in a larger campaign." His gaze moved systematically around the room, settling briefly on each suspect before continuing. "Mr. Voss, you were present in the Saporium building last Thursday evening, after hours, with master key access. You claimed to be working on board materials, yet subsequent investigation revealed that Miss Fenlow's office had been entered, her files photographed, and her correspondence with Dr. Corbett documented." Voss shifted uncomfortably. "I was attending to legitimate Saporium business. I did not enter Miss Fenlow's office. Your alibi places you alone in the building with unlimited access, yet you deny the opportunity," Wolfe observed with clinical detachment. "Curious logic, Mr. Voss." He turned to Celia Merritt. "Miss Merritt, you expressed amusement at what you termed a prank and suggested that certain people take themselves too seriously. You also inquired about alternative access to the prep room when Mr. Broom's keys went missing, keys that mysteriously reappeared in his coffee mug." Celia's bright demeanor flickered slightly. "It was just curiosity about security procedures, and it really was just salt, wasn't it?" "Mr. Broom," Wolfe continued, his voice softening marginally, "your missing keys created an opportunity that several people knew about. An opportunity that could have been exploited by someone with knowledge of your routines and access to your workspace." Evans stammered, "I don't know how they got in my mug. I was very careful about searching for them." "Dr. Corbett," Wolfe said, his attention shifting to the scientist, "your research into fraudulent artisanal food products directly threatened the business interests of individuals in this room. You were also the victim of an attempted break-in where another anonymous note was left. Some research should stay buried." Dr. Corbett nodded grimly. "My research exposes systematic fraud across the artisanal food industry. Someone clearly wanted to silence those findings. And silence you they attempted," Wolfe agreed, his voice gaining intensity. "But the common thread connecting all these incidents is not merely a desire to suppress research. It is a specific campaign to discredit Miss Fenlow before she could provide institutional support for Dr. Corbett's findings." He paused, allowing the weight of accusation to settle over the room like dust after an explosion. "The means employed suggest someone with access to specific materials, industrial salt, anti-caking agents, rice starch, and the knowledge to use them effectively. Someone who understood both the technical aspects of food adulteration and the personal vulnerabilities of the targets." Wolfe's gaze fixed on Karlick with laser intensity. "Mr. Karlick, you sent a gift of authentic salt to this house yesterday. A gesture of goodwill, you claimed. Yet within hours, 3 grams of irreplaceable Sarawak pepper were stolen from Fritz's personal collection, a collection known only to those with intimate knowledge of this household's operations." Karlick's Face had gone pale, but he attempted to maintain his composure. "Mr. Wolfe, my gift was entirely innocent. As for the pepper, I know nothing about any theft." The perpetrator knew precisely what to take and where to find it. Wolfe continued relentlessly. "They also knew how to enter this house without forced entry and how to leave their signature, a single grain of the same coarse salt used in the saporium substitution, placed deliberately on my desk blotter." He leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "You were unaccounted for last night during the attempted break-in at Dr. Corbett's laboratory. You attempted to bribe Miss Fenlow this afternoon, offering $50,000 to withdraw her complaint and dismiss my investigation. When she refused, you admitted that the unfortunate incidents had gotten out of hand." Carlick's carefully maintained facade began to crack. "I offered a settlement to avoid further unpleasantness. That's standard business practice. Standard business practice does not include systematic intimidation, breaking and entering, or the delivery of threatening packages to private residences," Wolfe replied with cold precision. "The industrial rock salt delivered to Miss Fenlow's home, complete with rice additives and anti-caking agents, came from materials you purchased specifically for this campaign. Materials that are the precise components of the fraudulent products you sell as artisanal." The room fell silent except for the sound of Kramer's rapid note-taking and Carlick's increasingly labored breathing. "You see," Wolfe continued, his voice rising with the authority of absolute certainty, "Dr. Corbett's research threatened to expose your entire business as fraudulent. 20 years of reputation built on systematic deception, industrial salt sold at artisanal prices with markups of thousands of %. When you realized that Miss Fenlow's institutional endorsement could destroy you overnight, you launched a campaign of escalating intimidation." Carlick's composure finally shattered completely. His hands gripped the arms of his chair as if it were the only thing preventing him from drowning, and when he spoke, his voice carried the hollow quality of a man who had run out of options. "You don't understand," he said, his words tumbling over each other in desperate haste. 20 years I built this business, 20 years of relationships, reputation, trust. Dr. Corbett's research would destroy everything, not just me, but my employees, my suppliers, everyone who depends on Carlick & Sons. So you chose to destroy Miss Fenlow instead," Wolfe observed with clinical detachment. "I never meant for it to go so far," Carlick protested, his voice breaking. "The salt substitution was meant to be a warning, show her that even experts could be fooled, that she should be more careful about the battles she chose to fight. But when that failed, you escalated to direct intimidation." Wolfe finished. Office break-ins, threatening packages, attempted burglary, and finally, the ultimate error. You violated the sanctity of this house. Carlick turned to Miss Fenlow with the desperate look of a man seeking absolution from his victim. "You don't know what it's like to watch everything you've built crumble because of one person's crusade for purity. I started with authentic products. I really did. But the margins were impossible. The competition was brutal, and customers couldn't tell the difference anyway. So you decided to cheat them," Dr. Corbett said, her voice sharp with scientific precision. "Industrial salt at artisanal prices, artificial coloring in natural products. You built your fortune on systematic fraud. And when that fraud was threatened with exposure," Wolfe concluded, "you attempted to silence the threat through a campaign of intimidation that culminated in criminal trespass and direct threats to personal safety." Kramer closed his notebook with the satisfied snap of a man who had heard enough. "Anton Carlick, you're under arrest for breaking and entering, criminal trespass, fraud, intimidation of witnesses, and conspiracy. You have the right to remain silent." As Kramer recited the familiar words, Carlick seemed to shrink into his chair, his elegant facade finally stripped away to reveal the desperate criminal beneath. The man who had built a reputation on authenticity while selling lies had been exposed by his own desperation and greed. "The irony," Wolfe observed as Kramer led the prisoner away, "is that Mr. Carlick possessed genuine expertise in sourcing and evaluating fine foods. Had he applied that knowledge honestly, he might have built a smaller but sustainable business. Instead, he chose deception and discovered that lies, like salt, have a way of preserving things far longer than intended. Miss Fenlow looked at the ceramic dish of counterfeit salt with the expression of someone seeing a snake that had finally been defanged. "It's over." "It is over," Wolfe confirmed. "Dr. Corbett's research will proceed with your institutional support. Mr. Voss will discover that his whisper campaign has lost its foundation, and your demonstration kits will contain only authentic materials." As the office emptied, Fritz appeared in the doorway with the satisfied expression of a man whose domain had been restored to proper order. The violated pepper tin had been replaced, the spice cabinet resecured, and the alien salt banished from his kitchen forever. "Dinner is served," he announced, and in those 3 words lay the promise that the world had been returned to its proper axis, where authentic ingredients were honored and counterfeit ones were expelled with appropriate ceremony. In Nero Wolfe's universe, that was not just justice, it was the natural order of things, as inevitable as good salt enhancing flavor, and as certain as the punishment that awaited those who would corrupt the fundamental honesty of the table. The office had the hollow quiet of a theater after the final curtain, but Kramer wasn't ready to leave the stage. He'd handed Karlik off to a detective in the hall and returned to plant himself where he could watch everyone at once. Notebook still open, pencil still ready. "Don't start celebrating yet, Wolfe," he said, settling his bulk against the doorframe. "I've got a confession and a pile of evidence, but I want the whole picture. No gaps, no guesswork." Wolfe adjusted himself in his chair with the deliberate care of a man preparing to deliver a lecture on a subject he had mastered completely. The ceramic dish of counterfeit salt still commanded the center of his desk, its alien crystals catching the lamplight like tiny accusatory eyes. "The picture, Mr. Kramer, is one of systematic fraud protected by escalating intimidation," Wolfe began, his voice carrying the authority of a judge delivering a final verdict. Mr. Karlik built his reputation on authenticity while practicing the most calculated deception. For 20 years, he sold industrial salt as artisanal treasure, with profit margins that could only be sustained through deliberate misrepresentation. Dr. Corbett leaned forward, her scientific precision adding weight to Wolfe's words. "My research documented the full scope of his fraud. His Himalayan pink salt contains artificial iron oxide coloring. His Mediterranean sea salt has the mineral signature of Pennsylvania rock salt with added compounds to simulate authentic sea salt. His artisanal black Hawaiian salt is industrial salt mixed with activated charcoal powder." 20 years of lies, Miss Fenlow said quietly, "and I almost lost my career protecting them." "Not protecting them," Wolfe corrected with characteristic precision. "Threatening them. Dr. Corbett's research required institutional endorsement to carry commercial weight. Your expertise and position made you the key to legitimizing findings that would destroy Mr. Karlik's empire overnight." I had been watching Leland Voss during this exchange, noting how his earlier composure had crumbled into something resembling panic. So Karlik recruited Voss to help discredit Miss Fenlow before she could endorse the research. "Indeed," Wolfe confirmed. "Mr. Voss provided the means. Master key access, after-hours entry, knowledge of Miss Fenlow's procedures. The salt substitution required someone familiar with the Soporium's operations and someone desperate enough to risk his professional reputation for the promise of permanent appointment." Voss found his voice, though it came out strained. "I never intended," Karlik said it was just a warning, a way to show her the dangers of taking sides in commercial disputes. "You typed the note," Kramer said, consulting his notebook. "Consider yourself seasoned. We'll match that ribbon you ordered to the typewriter you used." "The note was Mr. Voss's contribution," Wolfe observed with clinical detachment. "Petty mockery dressed as wit. But when the substitution failed to drive Miss Fenlow away, Mr. Karlik took direct control of the campaign. He gestured to the evidence on his desk, the office break-in, the threatening package delivered to Miss Fenlow's home, the attempted burglary at Dr. Corbett's laboratory. These were the work of a man with both sophisticated planning abilities and access to the specific materials of his fraud. The industrial rock salt with rice additives was purchased from the same suppliers who provided his counterfeit products. And the brownstone? I asked, though I already knew the answer would involve Fritz's violated pepper tin. Wolfe's eyes hardened with cold fury. The ultimate error. Mr. Carlick believed he could demonstrate his reach by violating the sanctity of this house. 3 grams of Fritz's irreplaceable Sarawak pepper, stolen with surgical precision. A single grain of his counterfeit salt left on my desk blotter as a calling card. That was personal, Miss Fenlow observed. Fatally personal, Wolfe agreed. When he made it a matter of principle rather than commerce, he ensured his own destruction. I might have been satisfied with exposing his fraud and securing your vindication, but when he violated this house, he declared war on everything this establishment represents. Kramer closed his notebook with the satisfied snap of a man who had heard enough. The evidence is solid. Carlick's confession at the library, the physical evidence, the timeline, it all holds together. Voss, you're looking at conspiracy charges minimum. The rest of you. He surveyed the room with the weary authority of a man who had seen too many crimes born of human weakness. Don't leave town until we sort out who knew what when. Celia Merritt, who had been uncharacteristically quiet throughout the proceedings, finally spoke up. I really didn't know. The typewriter thing, the jokes about pranks, I was just being stupid. Stupidity is not a crime, Wolfe replied without warmth, but it can be an accessory to one. Your casual dismissal of serious matters provided cover for those with criminal intent. As the office began to empty, Dr. Corbett gathered her research papers with the satisfaction of a scientist whose work had finally achieved its intended purpose. My findings will be published next month with the Saporium's institutional endorsement. The fraud will be exposed, consumers will be protected, and the artisanal food industry will be cleaned of at least one major source of corruption. Miss Fenlow stood, her composure restored and her dignity intact. Mr. Wolfe, you have not only solved the mystery and caught the criminals, you have restored my faith in the possibility of justice when truth is pursued with sufficient determination. Justice was never in doubt, Wolfe replied with quiet authority. Only its timing was uncertain. Mr. Carlick's desperation made him careless, his arrogance made him overconfident, and his decision to make the matter personal ensured that he would face the full consequences of his deceptions. After the last of them had departed, Fritz appeared in the doorway with a small silver tray. On it sat a single ramekin filled with the correct fleur de sel, its delicate crystals catching the lamplight like tiny diamonds. He set it on Wolfe's desk beside the ceramic dish of counterfeit salt. Authentic and fraudulent side by side, the difference unmistakable to anyone who cared to look. Order restored, Fritz announced with deep satisfaction. Order restored, Wolfe agreed, and settled back in his chair with the expression of a man who had successfully defended the fundamental principles that made civilization possible. The tragedy of Mr. Carlick's situation, he observed to me as the brownstone settled into its evening quiet, is not that he was caught, but that his deception was unnecessary. He possessed genuine expertise in sourcing and evaluating fine foods. Had he applied that knowledge honestly, he could have built a smaller but sustainable business based on authentic products and truthful representation. Instead, he chose the path of systematic fraud and discovered that lies, like salt, have a way of preserving corruption far longer than intended. When the preservation finally fails, the decay beneath is often more extensive than anyone imagined. The mystery that had begun with a grain of misplaced salt had concluded with the restoration of authentic order and the demonstration that in Nero Wolfe's world, truth always provided the final seasoning, even when it left a bitter taste in the mouths of those who had preferred comfortable lies. In the kitchen, Fritz was preparing dinner with the satisfied air of a man whose domain had been cleansed of contamination. The violated pepper tin had been replaced, the alien salt banished, and the natural order of things restored to its proper balance. Justice, in Nero Wolfe's universe, was not merely about punishment. It was about the preservation of the fundamental honesty that made both commerce and cuisine possible. And that, as Anton Karlik had discovered too late, was a principle worth defending with absolute determination. Saturday morning arrived with the kind of crisp October clarity that makes you grateful for windows and the promise of proper coffee. The brownstone had settled back into its natural rhythm like a cat that had successfully defended its territory. Satisfied, alert, but no longer bristling. I found Fritz in his kitchen at 8, moving through his domain with restored authority, the violated pepper tin nowhere to be seen, and a new ramekin of fleur de sel sitting on the counter like a small crystalline flag of victory. Disposed of the evidence? I asked, nodding toward where the ceramic dish of counterfeit salt had spent its final night on Wolfe's desk. To Inspector Kramer's laboratory, Fritz replied, his voice carrying the satisfaction of a man who had personally escorted contamination from the premises, where it belongs, with the other criminal materials. Wolfe was at his desk with the morning paper, the clean surface where the alien crystals had sat now restored to its proper dignity. He looked up when I entered, his expression carrying the quiet contentment of a general who had successfully defended his fortress. "The aftermath proceeds as expected," he announced. "Miss Fenlow called at 7:30. The board met in emergency session last evening. Mr. Voss's resignation was accepted with what she described as unseemly haste, and she's been asked to serve as interim director while they conduct a proper search. And Dr. Corbett's research will be published with full institutional support. The Saporium's first public symposium of the year will address authentication in artisanal foods. Justice, Archie, seasoned with appropriate irony." The phone rang at 9:15 with the kind of timing that suggested the universe had developed a sense of dramatic pacing. Saul Panzer's voice came through with professional satisfaction. "Final report," he said. "Karlik's talking like a man with a book deal. Full confession, complete cooperation, detailed records of his supplier network. He's hoping to minimize charges by providing information about 17 retail outlets, 12 restaurants, and 6 specialty catalogs, all selling his fraudulent products." And Voss? Singing harmony. Conspiracy? Breaking and entering fraud. He's looking at serious time unless he cuts a deal. Apparently, Karlik promised him permanent appointment in exchange for discrediting Miss Venlo. Greed makes people stupid, but it also makes them talkative. After Saul hung up, I settled at my desk with the comfortable sense of loose ends being properly tied. The mystery had been solved, the criminals were confessing with admirable thoroughness, and order was being restored to both the Saporium and the wider world of artisanal food fraud. At 10:30, Dr. Corbett arrived with a leather portfolio and the expression of a scientist whose work had achieved its intended purpose. Fritz showed her to the office, where Wolfe received her with the courteous attention he reserved for people who pursued truth with methodical precision. "The laboratory analysis confirmed everything," she began, spreading charts across Wolfe's desk. Karlik's operation was even more extensive than I initially documented. Conservative estimate, $3 million in fraudulent sales annually, with profit margins exceeding 4,000% on some products. She showed us photographs of salt samples under magnification. The industrial processing signatures were obvious, even to my untrained eye. Anti-caking agents, artificial coloring, rice starch additives. The evidence of systematic deception was overwhelming. "My research will be published next month with the Saporium's endorsement," she concluded. "Consumers will finally have the information they need to distinguish authentic from fraudulent. And Mr. Karlik will have ample time to contemplate the difference," Wolfe observed with quiet satisfaction. The rest of the morning brought a parade of resolution. Celia Merritt sent an email that attempted contrition with jazz hands. If you've never seen someone apologize while simultaneously proposing to profit from their mistake, it's an experience. She wanted to develop public education programming about food fraud detection, which Miss Fenlow would probably allow with adult supervision and clearly labeled props. Evan Broom delivered a handwritten note thanking us for standing between a good place and a bad act. He'd be measuring his coffee mug for the next decade, but Miss Fenlow hinted he might be assistant curator by spring. People who take responsibility for small things are sometimes ready for larger ones. At noon, we sat down to lunch. Fritz's lamb with rosemary, prepared with herbs whose provenance was beyond question, and seasoned with salt whose authenticity had been personally verified. The meal proceeded with ceremonial dignity, each course a testament to the proper relationship between representation and reality. Satisfaction, Wolfe announced as Fritz served the final course, derives not merely from solving the mystery, but from restoring the integrity of fundamental transactions. When we purchase artisanal salt, we should receive artisanal salt. When we trust institutional endorsement, that trust should be earned through rigorous standards. And when someone violates the sanctity of the table, they discover that certain principles are defended with absolute determination, Wolfe replied, his voice carrying the quiet authority of a man who had successfully protected civilization's foundation stones. The afternoon passed in comfortable routine. Bills were sent, reports filed, and the last traces of the case were properly archived. At 4, Wolfe departed for the orchids, leaving me to handle the paperwork that would officially close our involvement in the Saporium affair. As evening approached, Fritz appeared with a small package wrapped in brown paper, the replacement Sarawak pepper, sourced through Marco's network of connections. He opened it with ceremonial precision, revealing crystals that looked like tiny black jewels. His smile could have powered the house for a week. Restored? I asked. Repaired, he said, which was different and better. At 7, we gathered in the dining room for the evening meal. Duck with orange sauce, prepared with ingredients whose authenticity was guaranteed by Fritz's personal verification. The pepper crust crackled like applause when he carved it at table, and I decided some insults could indeed be answered in sauces. Wolfe ate with the attention that was his highest compliment, saying nothing about the afternoon's business while Fritz was present. It was only after coffee, when we had returned to the office, that he offered his final reflection on the week's events. He settled into his chair with a glass of beer and the expression of a man who had successfully defended the natural order against forces of chaos and deception. The clean desk, the restored spice cabinet, the banished alien crystals, all testified to the triumph of authentic over fraudulent. The human folly, Archie, Wolfe began, his voice carrying the weight of philosophical certainty, lies not merely in succumbing to greed. That is common enough. It lies in believing one can build an enduring enterprise upon a foundation of systematic deception. Mr. Carlick possessed genuine expertise in sourcing and evaluating fine foods. He could have built a smaller but honest business based on authentic products and truthful representation. He paused, tasting his beer with the appreciation of a man who knew its ingredients were exactly what they claimed to be. Instead, he chose to corrupt the fundamental covenant between producer and consumer. Salt, Archie, is not merely seasoning. It is humanity's oldest preservative, the substance that allowed our ancestors to survive distance and winter by keeping honest what time would otherwise spoil. When a man adulterates salt, he violates one of civilization's most basic trusts. Such violations cannot be tolerated because they threaten the integrity of every transaction that follows. You're saying he poisoned more than just dinner. I'm saying he poisoned the very concept of authenticity. When consumers cannot trust labels, when experts cannot rely on suppliers, when institutions cannot verify their collections, the entire system of honest commerce begins to decay. We stopped that decay, Archie. We preserved the principle that things should be what they claim to be. I looked at the clean desk where the counterfeit crystals had sat like tiny accusations. Think he learned his lesson? Mr. Carlick will have considerable time to contemplate the difference between authentic and fraudulent, Wolfe replied. Whether he learns anything useful from that contemplation remains to be seen, but others will learn from his example that deception, however profitable in the short term, eventually encounters those who insist on truth. The brownstone settled into its evening quiet, the kind of profound peace that comes after principles have been defended and order restored. In the kitchen, Fritz was cleaning up with the satisfaction of a man whose domain had been cleansed of contamination. The spice cabinet stood properly locked, the salt was authentic, and the world was arranged according to proper standards. "You know what gets me?" I said, preparing to lock up for the night. "He thought he could spice the truth and we wouldn't taste it." "Truth, Archie, has no tolerance for adulteration," Wolfe replied without opening his eyes. "It is either palatable or it isn't. We can refuse it, but we cannot improve it through deception. Mr. Carlick discovered that lesson at considerable cost." "Then we'll keep it plain," I said, and passed the salt. He grunted, which from him was consent. The case had started with a grain out of place and ended with principles back where they belonged. Outside, the October night kept honest time on the stone. Inside, the evidence was properly disposed of, the criminals were confessing, and the brownstone had successfully defended its standards against those who would corrupt them. In our line of work, you learn that seasoning doesn't make a dish. It reveals it. The rest is appetite and judgment. On West 35th Street, we keep both under lock and key, along with the salt that's exactly what it claims to be.